Mr. President, I've come to the floor this evening to talk about two issues that are of particular importance to me. I think when most look at me now, they think about energy and more typically Alaskan energy. I'm not going to disappoint tonight. I would like to speak to that. But I'd also like to speak this evening about the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, or the SPR. We've been talking about it a lot of late. It has been viewed as a source of revenue, pay for, if you will, with certain measures that we have seen of late, whether it be the transportation measure that we have in front of us, the budget deal that was executed a couple weeks ago, or other measures. So I wanted to take just a few minutes this evening to talk about the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. And I'd like to start by first addressing what I will call the flagship SPR. It's the really important stuff, if you will, within the reserve, and that's the crude oil. And I call this the flagship because there are 5 product petroleum reserve sites in the Northeast. We have product reserve sites for gasoline, distillate, and home heating oil, but these are relatively small reserve sites. They're about 2 million barrels total. I think their effectiveness is probably more controversial. But the flagship SPR is truly, when you think about the impact, the import to our economy and to a level of stability, the flagship Strategic Petroleum Reserve occupies giant underground caverns along the Gulf Coast. I've had the opportunity to go out and visit the site of one of our Strategic Petroleum Reserves. It holds some 695 million barrels, and they're ready to cover our nation's net imports for several months if global energy markets should spiral out of control. And I think the comforting reality about these flagship SPR is that through thick and thin, these reserves are rarely ever tapped, and they have offered a measure of security and stability that I think is unique in the history of global commerce. Amid higher levels of domestic production and lower levels of imports, a number of reforms are being considered for the SPR by the Department of Energy now. And there's been a lot of discussion. There's a study underway by the DOE and a discussion about upgrading the distribution capacity of the SPR is underway, and it clearly has merit. The North American energy landscape has changed so quickly and so dramatically that the volume of oil that we can pump out of the reserve is greater, and potentially much greater, than the volume of oil that we can actually move to refineries. And this is something that we need to understand and study more, but it is something that we have congested waterways. When you look at reversed pipelines, so on, ways that we can figure out how we can move this oil more readily if we so need it. And so in the measure that we have just executed with the budget proposal, there is there are funding set aside, if you will, for Strategic Petroleum Reserve maintenance, for life extension, hopefully for marine terminals, but effectively recognizing that we need to make sure that our SPR actually functions as it is intended. So this study is underway. We will learn more, hopefully, in the spring. But the imperative to have a functioning, workable SPR is one, again, that goes to the national security and really from an overall just stability argument. I remain opposed to suggestions by some that we should use the reserve to pay for completely unrelated programs, or that we simply sell off the entire stockpile, as some have suggested. I wrote a report in July of this year. We called it A Turbulent World. We have only drawn down the SPR on a limited number of occasions. In the entire history of the reserve itself, only approximately 166 million barrels have ever left the storage sites for any reasons. So 166 barrels have been sold off over the course of the life of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. And this is for exchanges, emergencies, tests, deficit reductions, everything that we have ever done that has involved a sale of the SPR totals just about 166 million barrels. So that's this graph over here. Over here are the new proposed sales to the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. If you add up the barrels, this Congress, the 114th Congress, has already committed to sell for SPR modernization, the Bipartisan Budget Act, the DRIVE Act, the Transportation Bill, and then a bill over on the House side, the 21st Century Cures Act. You are looking at a total of 279 million barrels to be sold off. That's, again, 40 million for SPR modernization, 58 million for the Bipartisan Budget Act, 21st Century Cures Act is 80 million, and the Highways Bill is 101 million. We'd be selling off 279 million barrels total. But think about that. In the entire life of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, 166 million barrels sold off. In one Congress, what we're proposing is 279 million barrels. Quite eye-catching. These numbers matter, Mr. President. The SPR is designed to provide 90 days of net import protection. So it's a pretty simple math equation that we're dealing here. If you import more, you need more in storage. If you import less, you need less. Now, currently, our net imports are about 5 million barrels per day. The bare minimum, therefore, that we need in storage is 450 million barrels. So if we execute all of the sales that the 114th Congress has either approved or is considering, what happens is we dip below that bare minimum that is required, the 450 million barrels, by the end of the 10-year window. I'm going to be releasing another report on the cumulative impacts of all these sales on the integrity of the reserve, so you should be seeing that in a few days. Now I'd like to turn quickly to a Department of Energy proposal to construct a new petroleum product reserve on the West Coast. We call this PAD 5. This is short for Petroleum Administration for Defense District 5. And PAD 5 is important because it consumes 17% of the nation's gasoline, 13% of its diesel fuel, and 30% of its jet fuel. Now, at the same time, PAD 5 is geographically isolated according to the Energy Information Administration. The approximately 30 refineries operating on the West Coast are responsible for supplying nearly all of its petroleum products. So the argument for a product reserve is relatively straightforward. Because PAD 5 is separated from the rest of the country by the Rocky Mountains and from the world by the Pacific Ocean, a stockpile of refined fuel should be established. Now, that's the argument that's out there. And I don't oppose a study of this concept, but I can see the pitfalls out there. PAD 5 imports over 1 million barrels of crude oil and petroleum products each day, suggesting that it really is not cut off from the world in the first place. And bear in mind the size of the district that we're talking about. Any stockpile would have to be really enormous to have significant impact. And finally, would federal gasoline reserves supplement or replace commercial stocks? That's a question that needs to be asked. So perhaps the solution is not a refined product reserve at all, but instead a return to basics, and that basic is crude oil. After all, there are reasons why we chose crude oil instead of the products when we first created the reserve, and by and large, that rationale really hasn't changed. First, oil is better suited chemically and economically for long-term storage underground. We don't have seasonal specifications on oil like we do on gasoline, and oil can be processed into an array of products while gasoline cannot. So, very quickly taking this back to Alaska. A gasoline reserve on the west coast of any size would really be small potatoes when compared to the incredible resource base that we have in Alaska. For decades now, tankers have shipped North Slope crude to the line of refineries that stretch from Anacortes, Washington, down to Los Angeles. Drivers up and down the coast fuel their cars with gasoline that is refined from this Alaskan oil every day. Alaskan North Slope crude oil is chemically similar to the kinds of oils stored in the SPR. In fact, according to the Department of Energy, over 30 million barrels of Alaskan oil have been stored in the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. West Coast refineries are optimized to run Alaskan crude. The Trans-Alaska pipeline system is only pumping about 500,000 barrels per day, down from 2 million barrels per day at its peak. So there's plenty of room in our already built, already operating pipeline. But the problem is, and you've heard me say this before, the federal government controls some 60% of the land in our state. More than 10 billion of barrels of oil are buried under our onshore federal lands alone, to say nothing of what is held in our offshore waters, but remain almost universally inaccessible to American explorers and producers. And that includes about 10 billion barrels in the non-wilderness portion of ANWR, where we're asking for permission to develop just about 2,000 acres, or 0.01% of the surface of the refuge. That's all we're asking to access. And beyond our ANWR resources, we've got at least another 900 million barrels in our National Petroleum Reserve, which is an area that is specifically reserved for development. And the estimate on the 900 million barrels there is that it's likely far too low. For the record, I would add that Alaskans overwhelmingly support development of both of these areas. More than 70% of Alaskans want development, understanding the significant economic benefits that it will bring and the strong record of environmental stewardship that we have in the state. We've got an opportunity here. We have an opportunity to develop our resources in order to create jobs, generate revenues, and bolster our nation's security and competitiveness. And by doing this, we can actually address not just one, but two threats. First, the Trans-Alaska Oil Pipeline is just 1/3 full, in large part because of the anti-energy decisions made by this administration, and the West Coast is more vulnerable to supply disruptions as a result of falling production. So you think about a crisis situation in the Middle East. The West Coast will need more oil. Its refineries are ready to run Alaskan crude, and Alaskans are ready to ship it, but there's nothing to ship because the oil is still in the ground and there's no way to transport it from the North Slope to the terminals in the southern coast of the state. I am not talking about keeping our oil in pristine condition, never to be used. Energy is not fine china that you just keep up on a shelf. The petroleum reserve is not a petroleum preserve. Our strategic stocks, barrels ready to go, should rarely be tapped. But Alaskan resources are already part of the daily life of Californians, Hawaiians. The resource must be accessible, though, but first they need to be accessed. Opening up Alaska's resources now would ensure that more oil is transported through taps. A healthy pipeline would ensure that oil can be shipped from Alaska to fuel the West Coast refineries when they need it and help ensure that energy remains affordable for the West Coast. So instead of constructing an entirely new product reserve, as some are contemplating, perhaps what we should do is preserve the infrastructure that we've already built and leverage it to boost our energy security. Why would we want to build a reserve when you can prevent a shortage in the first place? By letting a state that wants to produce oil, go ahead and produce the oil. That, to me, is sound strategic thinking. That would be a policy that benefits us instead of simply costing more money that we don't have. And that's the kind of thinking that I believe our nation and our future generations should have.